The sky above Korea looked peaceful that morning, the kind of blue that makes people believe the world is kind. Villages breathed quietly, birds crossed invisible borders without fear, and two small boys held their mother's hands as if nothing in the universe could ever pull them apart. No one told them that borders were being drawn by men who would never meet them. No one warned them that history does not ask permission before changing a child's life. Their mother felt it first, a tightness in her chest, a warning older than words. She looked left, then right, then down at her sons. One was older, serious, observant. The other clung to her dress, afraid of the noise in the distance. She knelt and pulled them close, breathing them in as if she could memorize their scent forever. When the soldiers came, everything became loud. Boots crushed dirt, rifles clicked, orders were shouted in voices that had no room for mercy. People ran, some fell, the air filled with smoke and fear. A hand grabbed the older boy's arm, another pushed the younger one back toward the road heading south. Their mother screamed a name, then another, but the noise swallowed her voice. That was the last moment the brothers saw each other. The older one was taken north. The younger one was carried south by strangers who promised safety but could not promise family. Both boys cried that night, but under different skies that belonged to the same land and completely different futures. Years passed, not gently, but forcefully. In the north, the boy learned quickly that survival depended on obedience. His name was Jin-ho, though it was rarely spoken with warmth. Hunger became a familiar companion, sitting quietly beside him during lessons, whispering distractions while teachers spoke about loyalty, greatness, and enemies beyond the border. The classroom walls were covered with portraits that watched every movement. Even thoughts felt unsafe. Food was measured, not eaten. Rice was a memory more than a meal. Jin-ho learned to lower his eyes when adults spoke and to clap harder than everyone else during speeches. At night, he listened to his stomach growl and imagined the sound was applause for a performance he had not volunteered for. Fear was not dramatic in the North. It was routine. It lived in pauses, in unfinished sentences, in the way neighbors disappeared without goodbye. Jin-ho understood early that questions were dangerous and curiosity could kill. Yet curiosity survived anyway, hiding deep inside him like a forbidden seed. Sometimes, when the electricity vanished and darkness covered the city, he imagined his brother. He did not know where the boy was, or even if he was alive, but the idea of him became a secret comfort. Somewhere, Jim-il believed, someone who shared his blood was breathing without permission being required. In the South, Min-jae grew up surrounded by noise. Cars, phones, advertisements, voices overlapping like waves that never rested. His life was full in ways Jin-ho could not imagine. Full plates, warm showers, glowing screens. But something inside him felt strangely empty. Freedom was everywhere, yet it came with pressure. Study harder, move faster, be better, win. Lose quietly, smile publicly, compete endlessly. Min-jae learned that failure was not punished by prison, but by shame. He learned that loneliness could exist even among millions. At night, while his city glowed like a galaxy fallen to earth, Min-jae sometimes felt a weight in his chest he could not explain, a sadness without a story, a missing piece without a name. He often dreamed of a boy standing on the other side of a fence, close enough to see, too far to touch. As years rolled forward, the brothers grew into men shaped by systems that did not care about their souls. Jin-ho became careful. Every word was filtered, every emotion restrained. He worked where he was told, praised when required, silent when necessary. Inside, however, questions multiplied. Why did the radio only speak in one voice? Why was the outside world described as evil if it never attacked? Why did defectors disappear instead of being debated? The answers never came, but doubt did. Min-jae, on the other hand, drowned in choice. What to study, where to work, who to become. Freedom overwhelmed him as much as control crushed his brother. He chased success, missed happiness, and told himself that was normal. Everyone around him did the same. One night, Jinho encountered something forbidden, and foreign recording passed secretly between trembling hands. Images of bright streets, music, people laughing without fear. It felt unreal, like fiction, yet something in his bones recognized truth. His heart pounded not with excitement, but with grief, for a life he had never been allowed to imagine. That same night, far to the south, Min Jae volunteered at a human rights organization without fully knowing why. He listened to stories of escape, of families torn apart, of brothers lost to history. Each story felt uncomfortably familiar, as if echoing something buried inside him. The border between North and South was only a line on a map, but it divided realities, identities, and dreams. One brother learned that silence could save him. The other learned that speaking freely did not guarantee peace. Both were prisoners. Both were free. Neither knew the other was still alive. And history waited patiently, as it always does, for the moment when truth demands to be seen. The days in the North moved slowly, not because life was peaceful, but because hope was rationed more strictly than food. Jinho learned to measure time by hunger rather than clocks. Morning hunger was sharp and impatient. Afternoon hunger was dull and exhausting. Night hunger was the worst because it came with thoughts. Work began before sunrise. He joined long lines of men and women whose faces had learned how not to show emotion. Factories roared, fields stretched endlessly, and slogans shouted from walls reminded everyone that suffering was proof of loyalty. Jinho worked with his hands while his mind wandered carefully, never too far, never too loud. A careless thought could become a careless word, and a careless word could erase a life. He watched people disappear. One day a neighbor would be there, the next day their door would remain closed forever. No explanations were given. Questions were not asked. Fear filled the silence like smoke. Jinho learned to pretend he noticed nothing, even when his heart noticed everything. At night, the illegal recordings became his secret rebellion. A few trusted hands passed them quietly, always changing locations, always afraid. He watched stories from the South, dramas filled with color, music, and emotions spoken out loud. People argued with their parents, children laughed without fear, streets glowed even after dark. It felt impossible, like a carefully designed lie meant to break loyalty. Yet Jinho felt something deeper than disbelief. He felt recognition. That world looked like the one he had seen in dreams, a world where his mother might have smiled instead of whispered, a world where his brother might have grown up without learning how to disappear. With every forbidden image, Jinho's loyalty cracked a little more. In the South, Min Jae's life accelerated. He climbed corporate ladders, collected achievements, and learned how to sound confident even when he felt hollow. He lived in apartments that were too quiet for a city so loud. His days were full, yet his nights felt strangely unfinished. Success arrived, but satisfaction did not. He listened to stories of defectors more often now. Their voices were calm, but their eyes told different truths. Hunger, fear, betrayal, escape through darkness. Every story carved something inside him. Sometimes he left work early just to sit alone and think, something he rarely allowed himself to do. The faces of those people followed him home. The border between the brothers was not just land and soldiers, it was information. Jinho asked death to see the South. Min Jae consumed news freely, yet never truly understood the North. Both were staring at reflections of each other through broken glass. Jinho's doubts eventually became unbearable. Fear had kept him alive, but it had also stolen his future. He began to listen closely to whispers about escape, stories of rivers crossed at night, of bribes paid with everything a person owned.
of friends who vanished halfway and were never mentioned again. Escape was not an act of courage, it was an act of desperation. Each night he rehearsed the idea silently, not words, just resolve. He knew if he spoke it aloud, even to himself, it might lose its power. Meanwhile, Min-jae found himself working late with an NGO that assisted North Korean defectors. He helped organize funds, transportation routes, and international connections. He treated it at work at first, methodical and distant, but slowly, emotionally, it became personal, too personal. One defector described a brother lost during childhood. Another spoke about a mother who never stopped waiting. These were not rare stories, they were common. That was what disturbed him most. Separation was not tragedy in Korea, it was routine. Jin-ho began preparing quietly. He ate less when possible to build tolerance. He memorized patrol schedules. He trusted almost no one. Escape required invisibility, patience, and luck, 3 things the North rarely gave. The night he decided to go, the sky was cloudless. Stars watched silently, indifferent witnesses to human courage. He carried nothing sentimental. Sentiment could slow a man down. His heart carried enough weight already. As he moved through darkness, fear did not shout, it whispered. Every step could be his last. Every sound felt like betrayal. The border was not dramatic up close. It was cold, ugly, and merciless. The ground did not care why someone crossed it. Far away, at that same hour, Min-jae sat in a quiet office staring at a list of unnamed people, numbers instead of faces, risks instead of stories. He felt restless without knowing why. He stood, walked to the window, and looked north, even though he knew he could not see anything beyond lights and clouds. Jin-ho crossed water so cold it burned. His body screamed, but his mind was silent. Silence had trained him well. On the other side, danger did not end, it multiplied. New borders waited, new enemies, new fears wearing different uniforms. Days blurred into nights. Trust became a gamble. Hunger returned, but this time it was mixed with hope, which was somehow more painful. Each step forward felt like stealing time from death. Min-jae received reports. One line caught his attention. Male, early 30s, crossed recently, status uncertain. No name, no history, just possibility. His chest tightened for reasons he could not explain. He forwarded resources, approved assistance, and stayed longer than usual at work. When Jin-ho finally reached temporary safety, his body collapsed before his fear did. He slept without dreams, because dreaming felt unsafe. When he woke, he was no longer in the country that raised him, but he was not yet free either. Freedom, he would learn, is a process, not a place. As officials asked questions, Jin-ho answered carefully. Old habits survived. Silence still protected him. But when they asked about family, something in his voice cracked. He spoke about a brother he lost as a child, unsure if he was alive, unsure if he existed beyond memory. That night, Min-jae read a file that included the same detail. A brother separated during the war. Age matched, location matched. Too many coincidences pressed against his chest. History rarely reunites people gently. When it does, it demands courage from both sides. The 2 brothers were now breathing in the same country, separated not by borders, but by time, trauma, and truth. And the moment of recognition was approaching, slowly, carefully, like a sunrise that knows it will change everything.
Freedom did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, almost suspiciously, like a visitor who did not trust the house it had entered. Jin-ho woke each morning unsure whether he was allowed to move, speak, or simply exist without consequence. His body had crossed borders, but his mind was still guarded by invisible walls built over decades. In the South, nothing waited for permission. People walked fast, spoke openly, laughed loudly. Screens glowed everywhere, voices competed in the air, and choices appeared endlessly. Jinho felt small inside that abundance. Too many options felt as dangerous as too few. He watched people complain about slow internet and cold coffee, and his chest tightened, not with anger, but confusion. He had survived starvation, surveillance, and silence, yet he felt unprepared for comfort. Min Jae was told to approach carefully. Reunions, they warned him, were unpredictable. Trauma made memories fragile. Truth arrived unevenly. But caution could not stop his heart from racing as he stood outside the quiet room where Jinho waited. When the door opened, time hesitated. They stared at each other not as brothers, but as strangers carrying familiar shadows. Jinho's face was thinner, harder, shaped by hunger and discipline. Min Jae's was softer, marked by exhaustion of a different kind. For a moment, neither spoke. Words felt inadequate. History crowded the space between them. Then Jinho spoke his brother's name, slowly, as if afraid it might disappear again. Min Jae felt his chest break open. They did not run toward each other. They stepped closer, cautiously, as men who had learned that sudden movements could cost everything. When they finally embraced, it was not dramatic. It was quiet, trembling, human. Two lives reconnecting where a nation had failed. The first tears came without sound. In the days that followed, reunion felt both healing and painful. Jinho struggled to sleep. Silence frightened him now because it no longer meant safety. He woke at night convinced someone was watching, listening, waiting for a mistake. Min Jae learned how to sit with him in those moments without asking questions. Presence mattered more than understanding. Jinho learned the language of freedom slowly. Not words, gestures, how to choose food without fear, how to speak an opinion without scanning the room, how to laugh without guilt. Each small act felt rebellious. Each ordinary moment carried weight. Min Jae, meanwhile, began to see his own life differently. His achievements felt hollow next to his brother's survival. His complaints felt childish. Guilt crept in quietly, asking questions he did not want to answer. Why him? Why freedom? Why comfort? He had no answers, only responsibility. They talked late into nights. Jinho spoke carefully at first, then more freely. Stories poured out of hunger, indoctrination, fear, and hope that survived despite everything. Min Jae listened, often in silence, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tears he could not hide. The South was not gentle with Jinho. Freedom did not erase trauma. Crowds triggered panic. Authority figures caused instinctive obedience. Choices exhausted him. Some days he longed for the simplicity of survival, even though it had nearly killed him. Min Jae learned that saving someone did not mean fixing them. Healing was not linear. Some wounds reopened in safety because safety finally allowed pain to surface. Outside, the world continued to argue about politics, borders, and ideology. Inside, two brothers rebuilt something fragile and rare: trust. Not in systems, not in governments, but in each other. Jinho eventually stood before people and told his story. His voice shook, but it did not break. He spoke of hunger, fear, and silence, not to accuse, but to remember. Each word reclaimed something that had been taken from him. Min Jae stood beside him, not as a savior, but as a witness. They learned that freedom is not the absence of chains, but the ability to face pain without being destroyed by it. They learned that survival is not the same as living. They learned that history can divide bodies, but it cannot erase blood. Some nights they sat together watching the city lights. Jinho no longer mistook them for propaganda. They were imperfect, overwhelming. beautiful, real. The sky above them was the same sky they had shared as children. Borders had failed to change that. And for the first time in their lives, neither of them felt alone beneath it. Time did not heal everything, but it softened the sharpest edges. Jin-ho began to understand that safety did not need to be earned every second. Some mornings he woke without fear, and those mornings surprised him more than nightmares ever had. Other days, a sudden sound or an unfamiliar uniform sent his body back into survival mode, heart racing before his mind could catch up. Freedom, he learned, was patient but demanding. It asked him to unlearn habits that had once saved his life. Min-jae watched his brother closely, learning when to speak and when silence was kinder. He noticed how Jin-ho flinched at raised voices, how he sat facing doors, how he ate quickly even when no one might take his food. These were not weaknesses, they were evidence of endurance. Slowly, Min-jae began to understand that the distance between north and south did not disappear with the border crossing. It lived inside people, shaped how they trusted, loved, and hoped. Outside their small apartment, South Korea moved at a relentless pace. News cycles changed hourly. People argued passionately online, protested freely in the streets, criticized leaders without fear. Jin-ho listened carefully to these arguments, amazed not by the opinions themselves, but by the lack of consequences. No one lowered their voice. No one checked over their shoulder. It felt almost irresponsible, and yet deeply human. One afternoon, Jin-ho asked a question that startled Min-jae. He asked whether people in the South were ever truly satisfied. The question carried no bitterness, only curiosity. Min-jae thought for a long time before answering. He realized that freedom had given him choices, but not direction. Comfort had protected his body, but not always his spirit. For the first time, he wondered whether suffering and freedom shaped people differently, but neither guaranteed peace. Jin-ho began studying again, slowly rebuilding an education interrupted by ideology. Facts replaced slogans. History expanded beyond a single narrative. Each discovery felt both liberating and painful. He mourned the years spent believing lies, but he refused to regret survival. Knowledge did not erase the past, but it gave it meaning. Sometimes he spoke about those left behind, friends whose faces remained sharp in memory, a mother whose fate remained unknown. He carried guilt like a second spine, strong, heavy, impossible to remove. Min-jae learned that survivor guilt did not fade with gratitude. It demanded acknowledgement. Together, they visited memorials, names carved into stone, countless and quiet. Jin-ho traced his fingers over them, understanding that remembrance was another form of resistance. The North had tried to erase individuality. Memory restored it. As months passed, Jin-ho's voice grew steadier. He spoke publicly not because he wanted attention, but because silence had already taken too much from him. Each story told was a bridge thrown across borders. Some listeners cried, some doubted, some turned away, uncomfortable with truths that disrupted their sense of safety. Jin-ho accepted all reactions. Freedom meant allowing others to choose, even when choice led to denial. Min-jae found purpose in listening, not fixing, not leading, listening. He realized that privilege carried responsibility, not guilt. He could not change the past, but he could protect the truth in the present. He could stand beside his brother, not above him. There were moments of joy that surprised them both, shared meals eaten slowly, laughter that came unexpectedly, music that Jin-ho played on repeat, fascinated by the idea that art could exist without instruction. These moments did not erase trauma. They existed alongside it, proving that pain and happiness were not opposites, but companions. One evening, Jin-ho stood on a hill overlooking the city. Lights spread below like constellations fall into earth. He breathed deeply, the air unguarded, unmeasured. He thought of the boy he had been, silent, obedient, afraid, and felt a quiet pride. That boy had survived, so this man could stand here. Min-jae joined him, and for a long time they said nothing. Words were unnecessary. They had learned that some truths lived best in shared silence. The Korean peninsula remained divided. Families remained separated. Systems remained unchanged. But within that vast, unresolved history, two brothers had reclaimed something essential. Not justice, not closure, humanity. The sky above them did not belong to North or South. It belonged to everyone who dared to look up and imagine a different future. And beneath that sky, two lives continued, not defined by where they came from, but what they chose to become. The world did not stop testing them just because they had found each other. Healing invited new questions, and questions invited responsibility. Jin-ho began to realize that survival had given him a voice, and a voice demanded use. Silence, once his shield, now felt like a betrayal of those who could not speak. He started small, conversations in classrooms, quiet meetings with students who listened more than they talked. He did not raise his voice or dramatize his suffering. He described ordinary days, how hunger dulls the mind, how fear trains the body, how lies repeat until they feel like truth. Ordinary cruelty, he learned, frightened people more than extreme stories ever could. Some nights, after speaking, he returned home exhausted in ways he could not name. Min-jae learned to recognize those evenings. Tea without questions, lights kept low, no news, just presence. They were building a language without words, one shaped by patience rather than urgency. The South continued to surprise Jin-ho. People disagreed loudly, even angrily, and then went home safely. Protesters shouted at police officers and returned the next day to do it again. The absence of punishment still felt unreal. Freedom, he learned, was messy. It did not promise kindness or wisdom. It only promised space. Min-jae struggled with his own transformation. His work no longer felt neutral. Every decision carried weight now. Numbers had faces. Policies had consequences. He began pushing for transparency, for accountability, knowing full well that comfort resists disruption. Some colleagues admired him. Others avoided him. He accepted both reactions as the cost of honesty. There were setbacks. Jin-ho had days when the past returned uninvited, vivid and cruel. He dreamed of being watched, of doors closing, of voices demanding loyalty. Waking up did not always end the fear. Some mornings he needed reminders, soft, repeated, that he was safe. Min-jae never treated those moments as weakness. He treated them as echoes, and echoes fade only if the space remains open. Letters arrived occasionally from those still escaping, still hiding, still waiting. Jin-ho read them slowly, carefully. Each letter carried gratitude and pain in equal measure. He could not save everyone. Accepting that truth nearly broke him. But Min-jae reminded him that bearing witness was not failure, it was resistance. They visited the border once, standing far from the fences, close enough to feel history pressing against their ribs. Jin-ho did not cry. He simply stood still, eyes steady, breathing deeply. He was not looking back with longing, he was looking forward with resolve. He spoke later that night, not to an audience, but to his brother. He said that freedom had given him something dangerous, choice, and he chose not to forget. Forgetting would be easier, forgetting would be quieter, but remembering was a responsibility he accepted willingly. Min-jae understood then that reunion was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a shared purpose, not grand, not heroic, but human. To speak when silence is convenient, to listen when truth is uncomfortable, to protect dignity wherever it is threatened. Years passed. Jin-ho's accent softened but never disappeared. He kept it deliberately. It was proof of where he came from, and proof that survival left marks worth honoring. He built a life that included joy without apology, friends, work, even laughter that came easily now. Min Jae learned to forgive himself for a childhood untouched by war. Gratitude replaced guilt. Responsibility replaced shame. He stopped asking why he had been spared and started asking how he could be useful. Sometimes they sat together and remembered their mother, not with certainty but with love. Memory filled the gaps truth could not. They allowed her to live in the stories they told, not as a victim, but as a woman who had loved fiercely in impossible times. The peninsula remained divided. Politics stalled, promises repeated, history moved slowly, stubbornly. But within that stillness, change existed quietly, carried by voices that refused to disappear. Jean Ho once said that freedom was not a gift handed over at a border. It was something rebuilt every day, choice by choice. Min Jae believed him. Under the same sky that had once watched them separate, they continued forward, not healed completely, not finished, but whole enough to stand. And in a world shaped by lines drawn by power, two brothers proved that humanity still crosses borders first. The years that followed did not soften the border, but they softened the men who lived with its consequences. Jin Ho no longer measured his days by fear, yet he never forgot how fear had once measured him. He learned to wake slowly, to let sunlight settle on his face without interpreting it as exposure. Some habits faded quietly, sitting with his back to the wall, eating too fast, while others stayed, transformed into reminders rather than scars. He began writing, not for publication at first, but for clarity. Words on paper felt safer than words spoken aloud. They did not interrupt. They did not punish. They waited. He wrote about small things, the taste of cornmeal, the sound of boots on frozen ground, the way children learned to applaud before they learned to read. These details mattered. They carried truth without spectacle. When he eventually shared his writing, readers said it was the ordinary moments that haunted them most. Min Jae changed too, in ways that surprised him. He slowed down. He learned to refuse urgency when urgency served no one but systems that thrived on distraction. He stopped chasing promotions that promised status without substance. He invested time where it could breathe. Mentorship, policy work, quiet advocacy that did not make headlines but altered outcomes. He learned that impact did not always announce itself. There were disagreements between the brothers. Freedom allowed for that. Jin Ho sometimes felt Min Jae underestimated how fragile memory could be, how easily it could be distorted by comfort. Min Jae sometimes worried that Jin Ho carried the past like a shield that might one day become a cage. They argued gently, honestly, and without fear of losing each other. That, too, was freedom. Occasionally, news from the north pierced the calm. Missile tests, speeches, images of crowds clapping in unison. Jin Ho watched with a steadiness that surprised even him. He did not flinch. He did not romanticize. He simply remembered. Memory, he had learned, was an act of care. It prevented lies from settling in. He was invited to speak abroad. The first time he boarded a plane, his hands shook as the ground fell away. He pressed his forehead to the window and watched the clouds gather beneath him, soft and indifferent. Borders disappeared from view. He wondered how many lives might change if people could see the world this way, small, shared, fragile. In foreign cities, he spoke to audiences who wanted answers. What could be done? When would things change? How long must people wait? He answered honestly. Change would be slow. Waiting would be long. Doing nothing would be the greatest failure. He did not offer hope as a promise. He offered it as a practice. Min Jae followed when he could, listening from the back of rooms, watching faces shift as understanding took root.
he learned to recognize the moment when empathy arrived, not loudly, but quietly, when people stopped asking what they could feel and started asking what they could do. They built rituals, weekly walks, shared meals cooked slowly, deliberately, celebrations that honored survival without glorifying suffering. Jin-ho learned to enjoy holidays without guilt. Min-jae learned to let joy be unproductive. These were small rebellions against lives once ruled by scarcity and speed. One evening, years after their reunion, they returned to the hill overlooking the city. The lights were brighter now. The skyline changed. Jin-ho noticed details he would have missed before: the rhythm of traffic, the laughter drifting up from below, the way the night held everything without judgment. He felt neither anger nor longing. He felt present. He spoke about forgiveness, not as absolution for systems that harmed millions, but as a release from carrying hatred that could never be satisfied. Forgiveness, he said, was not forgetting. It was choosing not to let the past dictate the future. Min-jae listened and understood that this was not a conclusion, but a direction. They stood together, older now, steadier. The story that began with separation had not ended in perfection. It had ended in responsibility, to remember clearly, to speak carefully, to act consistently, to protect the dignity of those whose voices were still confined to whispers. The sky above them remained unchanged, vast and shared. It had watched empires rise, borders harden, families fracture. It would watch, too, as people continued to choose connection over silence, truth over comfort. And somewhere beyond fences and slogans, beyond fear and propaganda, the possibility of a different tomorrow waited, not guaranteed, not sudden, but real enough to pursue. They turned and walked back toward the city, side by side, carrying forward a story that refused to be reduced to lines on a map.
The city accepted them without ceremony. Life rarely marked turning points with announcements. It simply kept moving, inviting those who were ready to move with it. Jin-ho noticed that the longer he lived in freedom, the more complex his emotions became. Relief had come first, sharp and overwhelming. Gratitude followed, steady but heavy. Later came anger, quiet, controlled, but real. Anger at what had been stolen, at years shaped by lies, at the knowledge that millions still lived the life he had escaped. He learned that anger was not the enemy. Unexamined anger was. So he gave it work to do. Jin-ho began mentoring new arrivals from the north. He recognized himself in their eyes, the caution, the exhaustion, the disbelief that safety could last. He never rushed them. He knew how fragile trust could be. He taught practical things first: how to use public transport, how to open a bank account, how to say no without apology. Freedom, he explained, was built from small permissions repeated daily. Some of them asked him if life ever became normal. He told them the truth. Normal was not a destination. It was a negotiation. Some days would feel light, others would feel impossibly heavy. Both were allowed. Min-jae watched these interactions with quiet respect. He saw how Jin-ho's presence alone steadied people. He did not offer miracles or easy hope. He offered understanding, which was rarer and more useful. Min-jae realized that leadership did not always look like direction. Sometimes it looked like recognition. Their conversations deepened as time passed. They spoke about identity, about how much of a person is shaped by place and how much survives in spite of it. Jin-ho wondered aloud who he might have been if the border had not claimed his childhood. Min-jae admitted that he sometimes felt like his life had been built on borrowed luck. They did not try to resolve these questions. They let them exist. The world beyond them shifted constantly. Tensions rose and fell. Headlines promised change and delivered repetition. People grew tired of waiting for history to improve. Jin-ho understood that fatigue well. He spoke about it when asked. Fatigue, he said, was dangerous because it invited forgetting, and forgetting was the most efficient ally of oppression. There were moments when the weight of responsibility pressed too hard. Jin-ho considered stepping back, living quietly, protecting the fragile peace he had built. On those days, Min-jae reminded him that rest was not retreat, that survival had already demanded enough. They learned to step away when needed, to return when ready. They traveled together once more, this time to speak to students who had never known division as anything but a fact in textbooks. Jin-ho watched young faces listen, some skeptical, some moved, some uncomfortable. He did not blame them. Comfort dulls imagination. He spoke anyway, not to shock, but to anchor history in human experience. Afterward, a student asked him whether reunification would solve everything. Jin-ho paused. He said that unity without honesty would only rearrange pain. Healing, he said, required truth before policy, dignity before strategy. The student nodded slowly, as if storing the idea for later. At home, life continued in ordinary ways. Laundry, cooking, shared jokes that made no sense outside the room. These were the victories no one reported. Jin-ho learned to enjoy them without fear of loss. Min-jae learned to protect them without guilt. On an unremarkable evening, Jin-ho received news that someone he once knew had made it across. The relief was immediate and sharp, followed by grief for those who had not. The two emotions coexisted, as they often did now. He allowed both. He had learned that holding joy did not require releasing sorrow. As night settled over the city, the brothers sat together once more, listening to distant traffic, the sound steady and unthreatening. Jin-ho reflected on how strange it was that peace could feel louder than fear. Min-jae smiled at that. They shared a quiet understanding that some truths could only be learned after surviving their opposites. The future remained uncertain. Borders still stood, families still waited, systems still resisted change. But within that uncertainty, something durable had taken root, not optimism that ignored reality, but commitment that faced it fully. They did not know how history would judge their time. They only knew how they would live within it. And that, finally, was enough. Winter arrived gently that year, without the cruelty Jin-ho remembered from the north. Snow fell without urgency, settling on rooftops and sidewalks like a quiet suggestion rather than a threat. He watched it from the window and noticed how his body no longer braced itself automatically. Cold was just cold now. It did not mean shortage. It did not mean punishment. He realized then that safety was not a single moment of arrival, but a long accumulation of ordinary proofs. Min-jae noticed the change before Jin-ho did, the way his brother lingered over meals, the way he laughed without covering his mouth, the way he spoke about the future using words like maybe and later instead of if. These were not dramatic shifts. They were subtle, almost invisible, but they mattered more than speeches ever could. Jin-ho was invited to help shape programs for new defectors, not as a symbol, but as a designer. He insisted on practicality over pity, housing that felt temporary but dignified, counseling that respected silence as much as speech, education that did not assume ignorance. He argued that people did not need to be remade, they needed space to unfold. Some officials resisted. Efficiency preferred simplicity. Jin-ho remained patient but firm. He had learned how systems functioned when they forgot individuals. He would not let that happen again, not quietly. Min-jae supported him from within institutions that spoke a different language, budgets, timelines, reports. He learned how to translate empathy into policy without draining it of meaning. Together, they moved slowly, knowing that slow progress endured longer than sudden reform. There were days when Jin-ho missed the clarity of survival. In the north, right and wrong had been enforced brutally, but they had been clear. In the south, ambiguity ruled. People could choose poorly and still live comfortably. That unsettled him. Freedom, he learned, did not guarantee wisdom, it only allowed it. One evening, while walking through a crowded street glowing with signs and music, Jin-ho stopped suddenly. The noise pressed in on him, not threatening but overwhelming. Min-jae noticed immediately. They stepped aside into a quieter alley. No explanations were needed. Jin-ho breathed until the world steadied again. "I used to think fear was loud," he said finally. "Now I know it can be quiet, too." Min-jae nodded. He had learned that listening did not always require words. News arrived months later that struck them both deeply. Someone from their childhood village had sent a message through distant channels. Their mother's fate remained uncertain, but there was evidence she had survived longer than they had believed. The information brought no closure, only complexity. Hope stirred carefully, refusing to bloom recklessly. Jin-ho sat with the knowledge for days. He did not cry. He did not speak much. He carried it like a fragile object, unsure where to place it. Min-jae waited, understanding that some truths needed time to decide how they would live inside a person. Eventually, Jin-ho spoke. He said that even not knowing was better than believing nothing had existed at all. Memory, he said, was a form of inheritance. Even incomplete, it mattered. They began to speak about legacy, not in grand terms, but personal ones. What would remain if they were gone? Jin-ho wanted the truth to remain, not as accusation, but as record. Min-jae wanted systems to remember the people they were built to serve. Neither sought recognition. They had learned how easily recognition distracted from purpose. Spring returned. Trees bloomed without permission. Jin-ho watched them with quiet appreciation. Growth, he realized, was not always loud or fast. Sometimes it was simply persistent. At a small gathering, Jin-ho read from his writing for the first time without his hands shaking. His voice was steady, measured. He spoke about a boy who learned to clap before he learned to speak, and a man who learned to speak after years of silence. The room listened carefully. No applause followed immediately. Silence arrived first, full, respectful. Then came applause, softer, earned. Afterward, Min-jae placed a hand on his shoulder. Jin-ho smiled, a genuine smile, unguarded. They walked home together under a sky that seemed larger every year. The past no longer chased them. It walked beside them, acknowledged, no longer feared. The story that began with separation had become something else entirely, not a tale of loss alone, but of endurance, of responsibility, of choice made daily and deliberately. And as the city breathed around them, indifferent yet generous, the brothers continued forward, not waiting for history to resolve itself, but living proof that even unfinished stories can carry meaning. Time passed with quiet insistence, shaping their lives in ways both subtle and profound. Jin-ho became accustomed to the rhythm of the South, yet he remained aware of the fragility beneath its surface. Ordinary days carried weight. Eating a full meal, walking freely, speaking openly, these were acts that once seemed impossible, now exercises in patience and gratitude. He noticed how quickly one could forget fear when it became habitual, and he worried about forgetting what had truly mattered. Min-jae watched his brother carefully, noting the way Jin-ho still flinched at loud noises or abrupt movements. He learned that trauma lingered not in dramatic displays, but in quiet habits, in the instinct to survive rather than to live. Together, they began to create routines that honored both their pasts and their present, cooking meals slowly, taking long walks, writing letters to those still behind the border, listening more than they spoke. Jinho began to travel more, cautiously at first, speaking at forums, sharing his experience with those who had no concept of the world he had survived. He learned to translate fear into understanding and pain into lessons without bitterness. His words were measured, deliberate. The world outside was vast and often indifferent, but he found that honesty commanded attention, even in places where distance made comprehension difficult. Min-jae joined him in some of these travels, observing quietly from the sidelines. He realized that advocacy was as much about endurance as action. Changing systems, he understood, required patience, humility, and a recognition that not everyone was ready to see the truth at once. Together, they became a subtle force, one carrying lived experience, the other carrying access and influence. There were moments when the past pressed against them unexpectedly. Reports of famines, disappearances, or tightened borders arrived like shadows on sunlit days. Jinho allowed himself to feel sorrow, to tremble briefly at the weight of knowing, but he did not falter. Min-jae reminded him gently that grief did not weaken courage, it refined it. One spring evening, Jinho walked alone to a quiet park. Cherry blossoms drifted lazily on the wind, petals touching the ground like soft reminders of impermanence. He thought of the boy he had once been, of hunger and obedience, of a life where hope was dangerous. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He carried the past with him, yes, but it no longer controlled him. He could look back without collapsing under the weight of it. He could look forward with deliberate intention. Later, he returned home to find Min-jae waiting. They shared a quiet meal, simple and deliberate. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by long silences that were no longer awkward, but comfortable. They spoke of the present, of responsibilities, of choices. They spoke of the people they had helped, the lives they had touched, and those they could not save. They did not dwell on regret. They acknowledged it, learned from it, and let it guide them without consuming them. At night, they often sat by the window, watching the city lights stretch endlessly into the distance. Jinho would sometimes whisper the names of those lost, those left behind, as if speaking them aloud ensured they would exist somewhere in the world. Min-jae listened quietly, understanding that remembrance was a duty, not a burden. In the shared silence, they felt a continuity that transcended borders, time, and the cruelty of history. The brothers came to understand that freedom was not a place, but a series of choices made over and over. Every decision, from speaking openly to listening carefully, from acting with intention to allowing patience, became a way to honor what they had endured. Life no longer demanded survival alone, it demanded engagement, presence, and courage in ordinary acts. And so, they lived. Not perfectly, not without pain, not without fear, but fully, deliberately in a world that had once been defined by limitations. The sky above stretched wide, indifferent yet constant, holding the same space it had when they were children. Under it, they walked side by side, carrying forward a story that had begun with loss and separation, but now thrived in endurance, resilience, and the quiet triumph of choosing to live. Seasons passed, each one quietly marking the passage of time. Jinho noticed how differently he perceived them now. Spring no longer carried only renewal, it carried responsibility. Summer no longer promised playfulness, it carried awareness. Autumn no longer meant decline, it carried reflection. Winter no longer felt like oppression, it carried clarity. Every season reminded him that life, like the weather, could change without asking permission, and that resilience was not built in comfort, but in adaptation. Min-jae observed him with admiration and humility. He had always thought that freedom was simple, a life without chains. He now understood it was far more complex. It required attention, awareness, and the conscious decision to live without being imprisoned by the past. He had grown alongside his brother, not as a teacher, but as a companion, navigating the same terrain of healing. One afternoon, Jinho and Min-jae attended a small community event for defectors and volunteers. Faces unfamiliar, yet familiar in their shared experience, surrounded them. Children laughed freely, some of them learning to speak without fear. Adults shared stories, some tearful, some joyful. Jinho watched quietly, realizing that life could persist even in the aftermath of trauma. That persistence was not loud or dramatic, it was steady, ordinary, and profound. Afterward, they walked through the streets, past the glowing signs, past cafes and marketplaces alive with energy. Jinho marveled at the ordinary beauty of daily life, the way people argued over trivialities, the sound of music spilling from open windows, the ease with which strangers moved through public spaces. He had once believed that safety and abundance were impossible. Now he understood that they were fragile gifts to be held with care and awareness. At home, they continued their small rituals: tea in the late afternoon, shared laughter over meals, quiet nights reading, writing, and sometimes simply sitting together. Jinho reflected on the past often, but differently now. Memories no longer only haunted him, they informed him. He could honor those who had suffered, those still suffering, without allowing the grief to paralyze him. One evening, Jinho received a message from a distant relative, someone who had survived the North years ago. The letter carried news of family members who were still alive, hope mingled with caution. Jinho and Din-jae read it together, absorbing every detail. It reminded them that even after decades of separation, fragments of connection could persist. That connection, fragile as it was, could be nurtured. Later that night, they returned to the hill overlooking the city, a place they had visited countless times. The lights of the city glimmered below, steady and enduring. Jinho felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with acceptance. The journey that had begun with fear, hunger, and separation had led them to this, a life not defined by borders, but by presence, responsibility, and the courage to continue. He turned to Min-jae, who had been quietly observing the city alongside him. Jinho said softly, "We survived, not just the physical challenges, but the invisible ones too." Min-jae nodded, understanding fully. "And we carry it forward," he replied, "not as victims, not as heroes, but as witnesses and as guides." The wind whispered over them, carrying the faint scent of blossoms and smoke, of life continuing despite everything. Jinho realized that survival was not the same as living, but living had arrived, patient and unassuming, ready to fill the spaces left empty by fear. They remained there for a long while, side by side, neither speaking nor needing to. The sky stretched endlessly above, constant and indifferent, yet somehow generous in its embrace. In that quiet, they understood something fundamental. The past would always exist, but it did not have to define the future. And under that vast sky, the brothers walked back home together, carrying not just memories, but the living proof that resilience, love, and choice could persist even in the harshest of worlds. They were no longer simply survivors. They were men who had reclaimed their humanity, and in doing so, had reclaimed each other. The final chapter of their story did not arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly, quietly, in small gestures that accumulated until life itself felt like a revelation. Jinho and Min-jae continued their routines, but now each moment carried the weight of understanding, the fragility of freedom, the endurance of memory, and the power of choice. One morning, Jinho walked through the marketplace alone. The air was crisp, alive with chatter, music, and the smells of cooking. He watched families moving together, children running freely, couples arguing gently over trivialities. For the first time in decades, he felt that freedom was not just the absence of oppression, it was a presence, alive in every ordinary act of life. He paused at a small flower stall and reached out, touching the petals gently. Their softness reminded him that the world, though often cruel, was also capable of beauty. He thought of his mother, of the brother he had lost and found, of the millions still waiting for relief, safety, and acknowledgement. Memory had shaped him, but it no longer confined him. Returning home, he found Min Jae in the study, reviewing notes for a community project. The room was filled with quiet light, the walls lined with books, some old, some new. Jinho watched his brother for a moment, noticing the calm strength in him, the same strength that had once guided him when he could not guide himself. He realized that family, finally, had become a force for resilience rather than fear. They spent the afternoon together, walking through familiar streets, greeting neighbors, and speaking with young defectors who had arrived only recently. Jinho guided them carefully, sharing both his survival and his insights, emphasizing that life was not about what was taken, but how one responded. Min Jae observed, supporting quietly, ensuring that the systems around them served rather than controlled. At night, they returned to the hill overlooking the city. The lights below shimmered like stars scattered across earth, and the wind whispered through the trees. Jinho spoke first, softly. "I used to believe that survival was everything," he said, "that if I made it through, nothing else mattered. But now I understand life is not just surviving, it's remembering, acting, choosing, and loving, even when the world is hard." Min Jae nodded. "We cannot fix everything. We cannot change the past, but we can carry it forward responsibly. We can be present where we are." The two brothers sat in silence for a long while, letting the night stretch over them. Each star in the sky seemed to remind them of the countless others they could not save, the voices still unheard, the lives still constrained by invisible chains. And yet they understood that their choices, their care, attention, and persistence had meaning. Jinho finally spoke again. "I don't know if the world will ever be fair. I don't know if borders will fall or if suffering will end. But I do know that we can bear witness, that we can act where we are, that we can protect what is human even when systems fail." Min Jae placed a hand on his shoulder. "And we have each other," he said. "That is enough to begin again every day." They stayed on the hill until the first light of dawn appeared over the horizon. Pink and gold spread slowly across the sky, indifferent, beautiful, infinite. Jinho felt a calm he had never known as a child, not because the past had changed, but because he had finally learned how to stand within it without being crushed. The city below stirred to life. Children ran to school, markets opened, conversations began. Life continued, ordinary and persistent, unafraid of what had happened or what might happen. The brothers walked down the hill together, side by side, carrying the weight of history lightly, with care and purpose. Their journey had begun in fear, separation, and survival. It had carried them through discovery, trauma, and reunion. And now it continued in choice, in presence, and in the quiet but unyielding affirmation of humanity. Jinho understood at last that endings were not fixed. Life did not close neatly. Instead, life continued, carrying both pain and joy, memory and hope. And in that continuation, steady, deliberate, and profoundly human, they found freedom, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. The sky stretched endlessly above them, holding witness to the journey of two brothers who had survived, reunited, and chosen to live fully. And under it, they walked forward, together, into a world that was still imperfect, still challenging, but finally alive.